My world shattered in one horrible moment. My heart sank as I sat there, phone clutched in my trembling hands, staring at a single photo that changed everything. I was back home in Los Angeles, waiting for Eric to return from Abu Dhabi. Eric, my husband and a UFC fighter, had left for what I thought would be just another fight. As usual, I watched the match from our living room, anxiously glued to the screen as he entered the cage. His energy was electric, a glint in his eyes that I knew so well. I was so proud of him, holding my breath with every punch, every dodge, every single move. And then, after the fight, he raised his hands in victory. He'd won. He'd done it. I felt a surge of pride, love, and relief. But now, only a few days after his return, I felt none of those emotions. I felt numb. I kept staring at the picture on my screen, hoping, praying that it was some mistake, some terrible joke. But it wasn't. It was Eric with one of the ring girls from the fight in Abu Dhabi, her arms draped around his neck, her body pressed intimately against his. The look in his eyes, the look I thought was reserved only for me, was unmistakable. I had found it by accident, of course. He'd left his phone on the coffee table when he went out for a jog. I'd never been one to snoop, but as his phone buzzed with a new message, curiosity got the best of me. And there it was. The photo was a bold slap in the face, a harsh reality staring back at me. I felt the air rush out of my lungs. I wanted to scream, to break something, anything. I wanted to lash out, but I couldn't even move. Instead, a hollow ache grew inside me, spreading, filling every corner of my being. My mind raced, replaying memories of the last few months, trying to find a sign, any sign that might have warned me. But there was nothing. At least, nothing that I'd noticed. When Eric came back from Abu Dhabi, he was different. Distant. I chalked it up to exhaustion, the strain of training, the toll of the fight. We were used to his post-fight mood swings. But he was usually affectionate after a win, proud of himself and proud to be with me. This time, though, he seemed distracted, detached. I'd asked if he was okay, and he brushed me off with a smile, a kiss on my forehead, and an assurance that everything was fine. But now I knew better. I knew why he'd seemed so far away. It wasn't exhaustion, it was guilt. And that guilt had left a gaping hole in our marriage. He came home a few minutes later, sweaty and flushed from his run, looking so much like the man I fell in love with that it almost broke me to look at him. He smiled when he saw me, but I could see a flicker of something else, unease. He sensed that something was wrong. "Hey babe, what's up?" he asked, wiping his forehead with the hem of his shirt. I couldn't hold it in. "Who is she, Eric?" His face froze and his smile faded. He glanced down at his phone, still on the table, still open to that horrible photo. He knew instantly what I was talking about. There was no point in denying it. He let out a shaky breath, looking away, and for the first time, I saw something raw and unguarded in his face. Shame. But it did nothing to calm the storm raging inside me. "Her name is Lena," he finally said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "She's one of the ring girls from the fight in Abu Dhabi." I felt like I was going to be sick. I turned away from him, not wanting him to see the tears burning in my eyes, the way my face contorted with the hurt and betrayal. "How could you do this to me, Eric? How could you?" He tried to explain, stumbling over his words, talking about the adrenaline, the excitement after the fight. He said it was a moment of weakness, that it meant nothing. But I couldn't believe him. How could he look at me and say it meant nothing? How could he reduce our entire marriage to a passing weakness? I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear about his excuses, his reasons. I just wanted to know why he'd thrown everything away, why he'd chosen her, even if it was just for one night. I couldn't understand how the man I loved, the man I trusted, could do something so callous, so selfish. For the next few days we barely spoke. He slept on the couch and I barely slept at all. My mind was haunted by images of him with her. Images I hadn't even seen but couldn't stop imagining. I kept asking myself if there was something I'd missed, something I'd done wrong, something that drove him to her. But deep down I knew it wasn't about me. It was about him, about something broken in him that I couldn't fix. I wished I could just let it go, pretend it never happened, forgive him and move on. But every time I looked at him, I felt a fresh wave of anger and hurt. I wanted to make him feel the pain he'd caused me, to make him understand what he'd done, but I couldn't find the words. And he, knowing he'd lost my trust, had no words left to say. The silence between us grew, a painful, heavy silence that seemed to fill every corner of our home. And as much as I wanted to believe that we could come back from this, that somehow we could rebuild, I didn't know if I could ever look at him the same way again. Days turned into weeks, and that suffocating silence settled over us like a heavy blanket, pressing down, stifling every ounce of warmth left between us. Eric tried. I could see that he was trying in his own way. He was always home, always around, quietly cleaning up, cooking dinner, making small attempts to reach out. But no matter how hard he tried, everything he did felt forced, like he was acting out the part of a husband who'd been caught, and was just trying to make it right without really knowing how. His apologies started blending into each other, rehearsed, strained, not the kind of apologies that came from a heart split open. They felt hollow. One day he brought home a bouquet of my favorite lilies. I could barely look at him when he handed them to me. My eyes locked on those pale, delicate petals, wondering if he'd given her flowers too. Had he looked at her with the same tenderness he used to look at me? Had he shared his secrets, his dreams with her? Each question made me sick, but they kept pouring into my mind, unanswered, dark and festering. "Rachel," he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence between us. "I can't tell you enough how sorry I am. I'll do anything to make this right. Just tell me what I can do." I wanted to scream at him, shake him, make him understand that nothing would ever make this right. But there was a part of me that softened just a little seeing him there, almost fragile, searching my face for some hint of forgiveness. But every time I thought I could start letting him back in, memories of that photo, of her in his arms, came rushing back, the betrayal stabbing me all over again. Then one afternoon, as I was cleaning out the closet, I found one of his old fight t-shirts, still smelling faintly of his cologne, faded but familiar. I remembered the early days of our relationship, when he was just getting started in the sport, still struggling to make a name for himself. I used to go to every fight, holding my breath, heart racing, cheering louder than anyone in the crowd. I had been his biggest supporter, standing by his side through every win, every loss, every painful injury. I had built my life around him, my hopes, my plans. And now it felt like he'd tossed it all away for a fleeting moment with a stranger. In a fit of frustration, I tossed the shirt into the garbage, unable to look at it any longer. But a strange, twisted part of me wanted to keep it, as if holding on to his past could somehow give me back what he'd taken. It was pathetic, but I couldn't help it. He'd stolen so much of me, and I felt too weak to let go of what was left. Later that night, Eric came into the bedroom, watching me as I lay curled up, staring at the ceiling. He looked worn out, lost, as though he didn't even recognize his own reflection anymore. He sat on the edge of the bed, the space between us feeling like miles. "Rachel, I know I've broken us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you have to know it was the biggest mistake of my life. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to understand that I love you. I never stopped loving you." Hearing those words felt like a knife twisting in my chest. If he loved me, how could he betray me like that? What kind of love could so easily be thrown aside, even if just for a night? I turned away, unable to face him. "Do you even know what you've done to me?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger and heartbreak. "You've taken away every bit of trust one had in you and us. And for what? One night with some ring girl you probably don't even remember." He sighed, his hands covering his face as if he wanted to disappear. "It wasn't like that," he mumbled. "I mean, I was out of my head, the rush after the fight, the crowd, the noise, it's no excuse. I know that. But Rachel, I never wanted to hurt you. I just made a horrible, selfish mistake." The hurt in his voice sounded genuine, but it didn't make me feel any better. In fact, it almost made it worse. I realized in that moment that no matter how much he apologized, no matter how much he claimed to regret it, nothing would ever erase the betrayal. I would always have this shadow between us, this feeling that I'd never be enough. For days after that conversation, I became consumed by an obsession to understand every detail of his infidelity. It was a strange, self-destructive need to know everything. Where they went, what they did, if he had touched her the same way he used to touch me. Part of me thought that by knowing every ugly detail, I could somehow confront the truth head-on, like ripping off a bandage. But every answer he gave only fueled my anger and despair. One evening I asked, "Did she know about me? Did she know you were married?" He looked at me, pain etched across his face. Yes. She knew. I felt as if a new, deeper betrayal had unfolded in front of me. Not only had he betrayed me, but he had done it with someone who knew he was married. Someone who still chose to be with him, fully aware that she was wrecking another woman's life. In a sick way, I found myself hating her as much as I hated him. It was easier that way, to place the blame on her, to see her as the seductress who'd stolen my husband. And yet, in my moments alone, I had to face the truth. It was Eric who had crossed the line. He had made a choice that shattered my heart into pieces that felt beyond repair. Over the next few weeks, we existed like strangers in our own home, speaking only when absolutely necessary, going through the motions of a life that no longer felt like ours. He tried to reach out, to reconnect, but I kept him at arm's length, afraid that letting him in would mean surrendering, letting myself be hurt again. But one evening something snapped inside me. I was lying in bed, staring at the empty space beside me where Eric used to be, when I realized I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't keep punishing him, punishing myself, reliving this nightmare over and over. If I stayed in this marriage, I had to find a way to move forward. But if I couldn't, then I had to let him go. The next morning, I asked him to sit down at the kitchen table. His face was pale, as if he already knew what I was going to say. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said, my voice steady but soft. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again. But I also know that I can't live like this anymore. So I need time, space, and you need to decide if you're willing to fight for us, to put in the work it'll take to earn my trust back. Because the way we're living now, is killing me." He nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. "Rachel, I'll do whatever it takes. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make this right, if that's what you want." It was a tentative step, a fragile beginning, but it was the first step we'd taken toward each other since the betrayal. It would be a long road, filled with painful conversations, tears, and an endless struggle to rebuild what had been broken. But as I looked at him across that table, for the first time in weeks, I felt a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way back to each other. A way to heal from the scars he'd left on my heart. Only time would tell if we were strong enough to rebuild, or if his betrayal would be the end of us. But at least for now, we were both willing to try. The days that followed felt like a slow, painful unraveling of everything I thought I knew about marriage, trust, and forgiveness. We had agreed to try, but every step forward was like walking on shards of glass, every movement heavy with the weight of what had happened. I forced myself to get up each morning, to go through the motions of daily life, but inside I felt numb. It was as if I had been hollowed out, the parts of me that once loved him replaced by suspicion, hurt, and doubt. Eric began attending therapy on his own, saying he wanted to understand why he had done it, how he had been so careless with something so precious. I think he hoped it would show me that he was serious, that he was committed to changing. He asked me to go with him, but at first I refused. I wasn't ready to sit in a room and bare my soul to a stranger, to dig into wounds that hadn't even begun to heal. I wasn't ready to hear him explain himself, to open up about whatever weaknesses had led him to betray me. But after a few weeks, something in me shifted. I was exhausted from carrying this burden alone, from holding back the flood of questions that haunted me every day. I agreed to go, though my heart was pounding as I walked into that office for the first time. The therapist's room was small and simple, with soft lighting and a couch that felt surprisingly comfortable. Eric sat next to me, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. At first I said very little, letting him do most of the talking. He spoke about the pressure he felt, the grueling hours of training, the constant adrenaline, and the loneliness that seemed to follow him, even in a room full of people. He admitted that after every fight, there was a high that quickly faded into a strange emptiness, a feeling he couldn't shake. I listened in silence, feeling both sympathy and anger twist inside me. I could understand that he felt pressure, even loneliness, but how could that justify what he'd done? When the therapist finally turned to me, I wasn't sure what to say. There was too much. How could I possibly put it into words? After a moment I took a deep breath and it all came pouring out, the pain, the betrayal, the way my trust had been shattered, the way I felt like I was losing pieces of myself every day just trying to keep going. As I spoke, tears streamed down my face, and I didn't bother wiping them away. I let him see it all, the raw, broken mess he had left behind. Eric reached out to touch my hand, but I pulled away. I wasn't ready for that yet. His face crumpled, and I could see the regret in his eyes, but it didn't make the hurt any less real. The therapist encouraged us to keep talking, to keep digging into the pain, the misunderstandings, the shattered expectations we both carried. Session after session, we started piecing together the fragments of our story, confronting the flaws in our relationship that neither of us had seen before. I learned things about him I'd never known, things that shocked me, hurt me, but also gave me a new understanding of who he was. He opened up about fears I didn't know he had, insecurities he'd hidden beneath his tough exterior. For so long I had seen him as strong, unbreakable, but now I saw a different side of him, vulnerable, uncertain, grappling with his own sense of worth. It didn't excuse his actions, but it did make me realize that he was more human than I'd ever allowed myself to see. Over time, our conversations shifted. We began to talk about the future, about what we wanted from each other, what we needed to feel whole again. He promised me that he would never let something like this happen again, that he would do everything in his power to rebuild the trust he had destroyed. Part of me wanted to believe him, to hold on to the hope that we could somehow find our way back to the love we once had. But another part of me was terrified, afraid of setting myself up for more heartbreak. One night after one of our sessions, he turned to me as we were driving home. "Rachel, I know this isn't fair to ask, but do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me?" His voice was low, filled with a desperation I hadn't heard before. I stared out the window, watching the streetlights blur as we passed. I wanted to answer, to tell him yes or no or something in between. But I honestly didn't know. Forgiveness felt so distant, so far out of reach. "I don't know, Eric," I finally whispered. "I want to, but I don't know if I can." He nodded, his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel. We drove the rest of the way in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. In the months that followed, I tried to find ways to move forward. I threw myself into my work, spending long hours at the office, avoiding coming home until late at night. Eric tried to be patient, giving me space, but I could see the sadness in his eyes whenever I walked in the door. He wanted so desperately to make things right, but I wasn't sure if anything could make it right. I started going to a support group for people dealing with infidelity, hoping to find some comfort, some way to make sense of what had happened. Listening to others share their stories, their struggles, I realized that I wasn't alone. I heard stories of people who had managed to rebuild their marriages, who had somehow found a way to forgive and move on. It gave me a sliver of hope, but it also reminded me of the harsh reality I was facing. One evening, after a particularly emotional support group meeting, I came home to find Eric sitting on the couch, waiting for me. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "Rachel," he said, his voice steady, "I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'll respect it. If you can't stay, if you can't forgive me, I'll understand. But I need you to know that I love you, and I'll keep fighting for us, for as long as it takes." His words hung in the air, filling the space between us. And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet, maybe not ever. But I could see that he was truly sorry, that he was willing to do whatever it took to earn back my trust. It was a small step, but it was enough to give me a glimmer of hope. That night, for the first time in months, I let him hold me. His arms wrapped around me hesitantly, as if he were afraid of breaking me all over again. We lay there in silence, our breathing syncing up, our hearts beating together. And for a brief moment I felt a sense of peace, a flicker of the love we had once shared. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time since that horrible night, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. As the days passed, Eric and I fell into a strange rhythm. It wasn't exactly a return to normal. There was still an undercurrent of pain, distrust, and tension between us. But we were both trying, slowly and painfully, to rebuild something, even if it felt like balancing on shattered glass. I found myself questioning every small moment, every word he spoke, searching for signs of sincerity or deceit. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that he truly regretted his actions and was doing everything he could to prove it. But the doubt lingered, a shadow that followed me, haunting every part of our lives. Eric continued his therapy, never missing a session, which impressed me in a way I didn't want to admit. He was taking it seriously, diving deep into the reasons behind his betrayal, confronting parts of himself he'd ignored for years. Occasionally, he would share snippets of what he was discovering, moments of vulnerability that gave me a glimpse into the battles he was fighting internally. He admitted to me one evening that, in some twisted way, he had been running from himself for years, constantly searching for validation, for something to fill a void he couldn't quite define. He'd thought that becoming successful, winning fights, and living a life in the spotlight would be enough. But the satisfaction was fleeting, always out of reach, and he'd buried those feelings instead of dealing with them. Listening to him, I began to see the depth of his remorse, the cracks in the armor he'd once worn so confidently. It was painful to watch, yet oddly comforting. It reminded me of the Eric I'd first fallen in love with, the young fighter who had dreams and fears, not just the confident, distant man he'd become. There was a rawness to him now that felt almost unfamiliar, as if he were shedding layers he'd held onto for too long. But as much as his efforts moved me, I still couldn't escape the nagging doubts. I had too many questions left unanswered, questions that would pop up at the worst times, leaving me feeling trapped in a loop of suspicion and sorrow. Every time he left the house without me, even for something as simple as a trip to the grocery store, I felt a surge of anxiety. The image of him with that ring girl haunted me, vivid and unrelenting, taunting me with possibilities I couldn't shake. I found myself obsessing over the smallest details, moments I'd never thought twice about before. Did he look at her the way he used to look at me? Did he tell her things he'd once told me? Had he been kinder, gentler with her than he'd been with me lately? The questions were relentless, each one a small jagged wound I didn't know how to heal. In moments of anger and desperation, I sometimes felt like asking him outright, demanding he tell me every detail of what had happened between them. But deep down I was terrified of what I might hear. I was already shattered. I wasn't sure I could handle any more pain. So instead I kept those questions locked away, hoping that somehow, someday they would fade on their own. One Saturday afternoon, Eric suggested that we take a trip out of the city, to get away from everything for a while. I hesitated, uncertain. The thought of being alone with him, away from the distractions of daily life, scared me. But a part of me craved it too. A chance to reconnect, to remember who we used to be, far from the shadows that had come between us. After a moment's hesitation, I agreed, and the following weekend, we set off to a small cabin by a lake, tucked away in the woods, miles from the noise and chaos of the city. The cabin was simple, cozy, and beautiful in a rustic, timeless way. The lake was a sheet of glass, reflecting the sky with breathtaking clarity, and the quiet was almost surreal. It felt like stepping into another world, a place untouched by the pain and betrayal that had plagued us for so long. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace, a momentary release from the constant ache in my chest. Eric seemed nervous, cautious, as if he were afraid of doing anything that might break the fragile calm between us. We spent our days wandering through the woods, talking about nothing in particular, sharing small moments that felt almost normal. At night, we'd sit by the fire, wrapped in blankets, sipping wine in comfortable silence. There were times when he would reach for my hand, and I would let him, feeling a strange warmth, a glimmer of the connection we'd once had. One evening, as the sun set over the lake, casting everything in a soft, golden light, Eric turned to me, his face serious. "Rachel, I know it's going to take time, maybe even a lifetime, for you to trust me again. And I'll spend that lifetime proving myself to you if that's what it takes. I want you to know that I'm not running from this, from us. I'm here, fully committed to fixing what I broke." His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity and something else, something that almost felt like desperation. I could see the toll this had taken on him, the weight he was carrying, the guilt that seemed to follow him as relentlessly as the pain followed me. Part of me wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but another part of me held back, still guarding my heart. I looked out over the lake, gathering my thoughts, trying to find the right words. "Eric, I want to believe you. I really do. But there's a part of me that's still so hurt, so angry. I don't know if I can ever fully let go of that. I don't know if I can ever look at you the way I used to." He nodded, his expression somber, accepting. "I understand. And I don't expect you to just forget. I know I'll have to live with what I've done, and that maybe it'll always be there between us. But I promise you, Rachel, I'll spend every day trying to be the man you deserve. We sat there in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, the darkness settling around us like a comforting blanket. For a moment it felt as if time had stopped, as if we were the only two people in the world, suspended in that delicate, fragile space between forgiveness and heartbreak. Over the next few months, I began to see changes in Eric that I hadn't anticipated. He was softer, more patient, no longer hiding behind his bravado. He became more open, more vulnerable, sharing things with me he'd never shared before. He was working hard, trying to repair the damage, trying to prove to me and to himself that he could be better, that he could be worthy of my love again. And slowly, bit by bit, I found myself softening too, letting go of some of the anger, the resentment, the hurt that had been my constant companions. But the journey was far from easy. There were setbacks, days when the pain flared up again, sharp and fresh, triggered by a memory or a stray thought. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was making a mistake, if I was setting myself up for more heartbreak. But each time those doubts crept in, I reminded myself of the progress we'd made, the small steps we'd taken, the way he looked at me now, with an honesty and vulnerability I hadn't seen in years. We began building new routines, creating new memories to replace the painful ones. We took up cooking together, experimenting with recipes, laughing over our failed attempts and celebrating the small victories. We started going for morning runs, pushing each other, challenging each other, building a new kind of intimacy through shared moments of struggle and triumph. It wasn't the life we'd had before, but it was something, a fragile beginning, a foundation on which we could try to rebuild. One evening as we sat on the couch, wrapped in a comfortable silence, Eric turned to me, his face thoughtful. "Rachel," he said softly, "thank you. Thank you for giving me this chance. I know it hasn't been easy and I know I still have a long way to go. But I promise you, I'll never take this for granted again." For the first time I felt a surge of hope, a glimmer of something that had been missing for so long. I reached for his hand and this time I didn't pull away. We sat there, hands entwined, in a quiet, peaceful moment that felt like a small victory, a testament to the resilience of love, even in the face of betrayal. And as we sat there, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward. That maybe, despite everything, we could still find a way back to each other. As the months passed, that glimmer of hope grew, but it never fully drowned out the doubts. Our life began to feel stable again, more predictable, but my heart remained guarded. Despite Eric's patience and the countless reassurances, I still felt like a part of me was always on high alert, bracing for the worst. He could see that too, I think, and though he never said anything, there was a sadness in his eyes whenever he caught me pulling back. Yet, amidst the pain, we kept going. We went to therapy together week after week, unpacking every painful memory, every scar that had been left by his betrayal. Some sessions left us feeling closer, like we'd taken another step toward healing. Other sessions ended in tears and exhaustion, leaving both of us feeling drained and wondering if we'd ever find real peace. One night, as we sat in the quiet of our living room, Eric took my hand, his touch gentle but insistent. "Rachel," he said, his voice soft, "I know this journey has been hell for you, but I need you to know that there isn't a day that goes by that I'm not thinking of you, thinking of us. And I'll keep proving myself to you, for as long as it takes." I studied his face in that moment, taking in the earnestness, the pleading look in his eyes. I wanted to believe him, to accept that we could truly move on and rebuild something new. But as much as I loved him, and I did still love him, there was a wall around my heart that I couldn't seem to tear down. "Eric, I know you're trying," I finally replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I can see the effort you're putting in. But sometimes, I feel like I'm fighting against myself. I want to forgive you, to let go of this pain, but I don't know how. I don't know if I ever really will." He nodded, his eyes downcast, understanding the weight of my words. He knew better than anyone that forgiveness couldn't be forced. And yet, he didn't pull away, didn't retreat into himself like he once might have. Instead, he held my hand tighter, as if anchoring himself to the promise he had made to me. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on what we had been through, on the love we had shared and the betrayal that had nearly broken us. I remembered our early days together, how inseparable we'd been, how we'd built our life from the ground up, supporting each other through every challenge. I remembered our quiet, intimate moments, the way we used to laugh together, how we dreamed about a future that seemed so full of possibilities. And I realized that, despite the hurt, I still wanted that life, that future. I was tired of carrying the bitterness, tired of feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. I wanted to believe that we could heal, even if it meant redefining everything we thought we knew about each other. And so, I made a decision. One evening after a quiet dinner, I turned to Eric, feeling a mix of fear and resolve. "Eric," I said, my voice trembling, "I want us to try something new. I don't want to just survive this, to just exist in this marriage. I want to find a way to truly live again, to rediscover who we are, both together and apart." He looked at me, surprised but hopeful. "What do you mean?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "I mean, I want us to start over," I replied, the words feeling strange yet powerful as they left my lips. "I want to let go of everything that happened, to leave it in the past and rebuild something new. I know it won't be easy and it might take a long time, but I don't want to carry this weight anymore. I want to find a way to forgive you, to forgive myself for staying, and to see if we can create something even stronger." A mixture of relief and disbelief washed over his face. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion, "I'll do whatever it takes. I promise you I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, making you feel loved and secure. Whatever you need from me, I'm here." We decided to start small, to spend time reconnecting as if we were dating again, rediscovering each other without the weight of the past looming over us. We went on new dates, exploring places we'd never been, trying activities we'd never done before. Each experience brought new laughter, new memories, small reminders of why we had fallen in love in the first place. Slowly, I felt myself beginning to trust again, inch by painful inch, letting down my guard bit by bit. One night we took a spontaneous drive up the coast, the sky painted with stars, the ocean stretching out endlessly beside us. We found a small beach and sat on the sand, the cool breeze carrying the sound of waves crashing against the shore. Sitting there in the moonlight, I felt a calmness that I hadn't felt in months. It was as if the universe was giving us permission to let go, to start fresh. "Rachel," he said, breaking the silence, "thank you for giving me this chance, for believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it." I looked at him, feeling a warmth that I hadn't felt in a long time. "I'm not doing it for you, Eric," I replied softly. "I'm doing it for us. For myself. Because I realized that holding on to the pain was only hurting me, keeping me trapped in a place I didn't want to be." He nodded, understanding. And in that moment I knew that something had shifted, that we were truly beginning to heal. The betrayal hadn't disappeared, and I knew it never would. But its hold on me was loosening, fading into something that I could live with, that I could accept as part of our story but not the whole of it. In the weeks that followed, we continued to build this new life together, each day feeling like a tentative step forward. There were still difficult moments, of course, moments when the pain resurfaced, when memories threatened to pull me back. But now there was also a strength, a resilience that I hadn't known I possessed. One evening, as we were lying in bed, Eric turned to me, his face serious. "Rachel, do you think you'll ever be able to fully forgive me?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet vulnerability. I took a deep breath, considering his question. "I think forgiveness is a journey, Eric. It's not something that happens overnight. But I'm willing to keep walking that path with you, as long as we're both committed to growing and healing. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm willing to find out." He reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "That's all I could ever ask for," he replied, his eyes filled with gratitude. And for the first time in a long time I felt a sense of peace, a sense that maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay. Our marriage wasn't perfect, it would never be perfect, but it was real, raw, and filled with a newfound depth that had been born out of pain, struggle, and an unbreakable will to move forward. In the end, we were two people who had chosen to love each other, despite the scars, despite the mistakes, despite everything. And in that love I found a strength I hadn't known I possessed, a resilience that carried me through the darkness and into the light. I knew there would still be challenges ahead, but I also knew that we were ready to face them together, one day at a time, one small step at a time, in the hope that love would be enough to carry us through. The months stretched into a year, and in that time the bond between Eric and me slowly began to transform. Our lives shifted away from the pain of the past, although memories still resurfaced in unexpected moments, reminders of everything we'd been through. There were times, small and often fleeting, when I'd find myself wondering if I'd made the right choice in staying. Yet every time those doubts threatened to pull me back, I reminded myself of how far we'd come, of how hard we'd fought to rebuild what we had lost. Eric had changed in ways I hadn't expected. He was more open, more willing to share his struggles, his emotions. In the past, he'd always been a private person, locked up behind his strength, the very picture of a fighter who showed no weakness. But now there was a new side to him, a vulnerability he'd learned to embrace. And for the first time I began to see him not just as my husband but as a person who had made a terrible mistake, yes, but one who was committed to making amends, to growing, to becoming someone better. Our marriage evolved in ways that were both painful and beautiful. We started having honest conversations about everything. Our fears, our insecurities, our dreams, even the doubts that lingered. I began to tell him about the times I'd questioned our future, the days when I'd felt trapped in my own resentment, wondering if I'd ever truly heal. And he listened, really listened, without defensiveness or excuses. He let my anger and sadness wash over him, absorbing every word, every hurtful memory, and holding it without judgment. One evening after a long day, we sat together on our porch, wrapped in blankets as we watched the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange, the world around us quiet, peaceful. I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his arm around me, a sense of calm settling over us. "Rachel," he began, his voice soft, "I know I don't deserve the second chance you've given me, and I know there's nothing I can say or do to erase the hurt I've caused you. But I promise you, I will spend every day being the husband you deserve." His words were sincere, his eyes filled with a determination that had grown with each passing day. I could see how deeply he meant it, how committed he was to being a better man. And in that moment I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, we could create something new, something stronger. We began creating rituals together, small gestures of love and commitment that helped rebuild the trust we'd lost. Every morning he would leave a note on my bedside table, a few simple words reminding me of his love, his gratitude. And in return I started leaving little notes for him too, reminders that I was still here, that I was choosing to stay. It was a small thing, a daily ritual that seemed insignificant, but it became a lifeline, a thread that connected us even on the hardest days. Our home, once filled with tension and silence, became a place of healing, of new beginnings. We redecorated, changing small things here and there, making our space feel like a fresh start. Together we painted the walls, rearranged the furniture, added small touches that reflected our new lives. It was symbolic, a physical manifestation of our commitment to let go of the past and build a future we could both feel proud of. One day, as we were unpacking a box of books, Eric stumbled upon our old wedding album. He looked at me, a question in his eyes, and I nodded, feeling a mix of anticipation and fear. We sat on the floor, flipping through the pages together, reliving each memory, each moment captured in time. I saw the joy in our faces, the laughter, the love that had once seemed unbreakable. And as I looked at those photos, I felt a wave of sadness, a grief for the innocence we had lost. But I also felt a strange sense of acceptance, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, we could build something new from the ashes of what we'd once had. "Do you regret it?" I asked him softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you regret everything we've been through, even the pain?" He looked at me, his gaze steady, his face filled with an honesty I'd rarely seen before. "I regret hurting you, Rachel," he replied. "But I don't regret the lessons it's taught me. I don't regret the chance to become someone better, to build a love that's stronger than anything I ever imagined. I know it sounds strange, but in some ways I'm grateful for the pain because it's brought us here, to a place I never thought we'd reach." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. I understood what he meant, even if it was hard to accept. The pain had transformed us, had forced us to confront parts of ourselves we'd ignored for too long. It had broken us, but it had also shaped us into something new, something that was still fragile but filled with a quiet strength. As the months continued, we kept growing, learning, rebuilding. We traveled together, visiting new places, creating memories that helped replace the painful ones. We hiked through mountains, watched the sun rise over unfamiliar landscapes, shared quiet moments that felt like gifts. Each trip, each shared experience became a building block in the foundation of our new life. One evening, as we sat by a fire on one of our trips, Eric reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. My heart skipped a beat as he opened it, revealing a delicate, simple ring. "Rachel," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I know I don't deserve to ask this, but I want to. Will you renew our vows with me? Will you let me make new promises to you? Ones that I'll spend the rest of my life keeping?" I was taken aback, my mind swirling with a mix of emotions. Surprise, joy, fear, hope. I looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity, the love that had grown deeper, more profound in the wake of everything we'd been through. And in that moment I knew my answer. "Yes," I whispered, my voice filled with a certainty I hadn't felt in a long time. "Yes, I'll renew my vows with you." We planned a small ceremony, just the two of us, on a secluded beach at sunset. It was simple, intimate, a quiet promise between us, witnessed only by the sea and the sky. As we stood there, hand in hand, Eric repeated the vows he'd written. Words filled with love, remorse, and an unwavering commitment to our future. I listened, my heart pounding, feeling the weight of each promise, each word sinking into my soul. And then it was my turn. I took a deep breath, feeling the words rise within me. Words I'd been holding onto for so long. "Eric," I began, my voice steady. "I've loved you from the moment we met, through every joy, every heartbreak, every challenge. I promise to forgive, to let go of the pain, and to build a future with you that's filled with trust, with honesty, with love. I promise to stand by you, not because of our past, but because of the person you are today, the person you've worked so hard to become. And I promise to let go of the fear, to embrace the possibility of happiness, and to love you with everything I have." As I finished, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a sense of freedom, of release. We exchanged rings, sealing our promises, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm golden light, I felt a peace I hadn't known was possible. In the months that followed, I realized that we were no longer living in the shadow of the past. We were free, truly free, to build the life we wanted, unburdened by the mistakes and regrets that had once haunted us. Our love wasn't perfect, but it was real, raw, forged in the fire of pain and resilience. And in that imperfect love I found a strength, a joy, a fulfillment I hadn't known was possible. We had come through the storm, scarred but unbroken, stronger for the journey we'd shared. And as I looked at Eric, as I held his hand, I knew that we were ready to face whatever came next, together, with a love that had been tested, refined, and reborn.